You ever scroll through your news feed and just wonder who's really calling the shots behind the scenes? And maybe even more, like, who's actually paying for it all?
Yeah, it's a big question, right?
Yeah.
Especially these days.
Totally. And it's pretty much front and center in what we're digging into right now.
Exactly. We've got this document here. It's an executive order just issued May 1st, 2025. The title is Ending Taxpayer Subsidization of Biased Media.
Okay, wow. That's direct.
It is. It's definitely a piece of policy that makes you stop and think about, that whole relationship between government money and the media we all consume.
Okay. Ending taxpayer subsidization of biased media.
Let's try and unpack the core argument there. What are they really laying out?
Well, at its heart, the order is basically saying that the whole reason for government funding of news, especially thinking about places like NPR and PBS, it's kind of outdated.
Outdated how? It points to just the sheer number and, the diversity of news sources we have now. Yeah. Think about it. Compared to 1967, when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the CPB, was set up, it's a completely different world.
Right. Night and day, really.
Exactly. So the order suggests that in this media environment, government subsidies aren't really necessary anymore. And maybe, it even hints, they could be sort of harmful.
Harmful how? Like undermining trust or something?
Yeah, potentially undermining the perception of journalistic independence. That seems to be the idea.
Interesting. So it's not just saying the funding isn't needed, but that its presence could actually create a problem in how people see the news they're getting from those sources.
Precisely. And it goes on to say that if taxpayer money is going to be used for public broadcasting, then those funds really need to be strictly for news. That is, and I'm quoting here, fair, accurate, unbiased, and nonpartisan.
Okay, that's a high bar.
It is. And then it makes this key point. No media outlet, none, has some kind of constitutional right to get taxpayer money. The government gets to decide what activities it wants to subsidize.
Okay. Now, this isn't just coming out of nowhere, though, right? I think you mentioned the order brings up some existing rules.
That's right. Yeah, that's a really critical piece of this. The executive order specifically points to the CPB's own founding law, its governing statute.
The CPD, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Yes. And it highlights the part of that law that actually prohibits the CPB from contributing to or, supporting any political party.
Ah, okay, so there's already a rule against political ties.
There is. And the order then basically argues that by funding NPR and PBS, the CPB isn't fully living up to that rule. It sort of implies that funding them at all is problematic in this context, regardless of the specific shows or viewpoints.
So the concern isn't necessarily about, finding a specific biased segment on a show?
Not necessarily pinpointing one thing, no.
It's more the principle. The idea that taxpayer money going to any news outlet that might have some kind of perceived lean, even if it's not intentional, is the issue.
That seems to be a fair reading of the argument, yeah. Any potential for bias, even perceived bias, in news funded by taxpayers is seen as running counter to this ideal of strict impartiality they're talking about.
Gotcha.
And so, based on that core reasoning and pointing to these existing regulations, the order then lays out some very concrete actions.
Right, okay. So what are the actual marching orders? What's the CPB being told it has to do?
The instructions for the CPD Board of Directors are pretty explicit. The order basically tells them to stop funding NPR and PBS, both direct funding and indirect funding.
Indirect funding, what does that mean exactly? Like money passed through other stations or something?
Yeah, potentially. It means stopping direct payments, obviously, but also making sure CPB money doesn't end up supporting NPR or PBS, even if it goes through, say, a local station grant first. They want to cut off all channels.
Okay, so it's meant to be pretty comprehensive. Is there a timeline? Do they have to do this, tomorrow?
There are deadlines, yes. The order says the CPB board needs to immediately take steps to cancel any existing direct funding deals, as much as the law allows anyway, and they have to say no to any future funding requests from NPR and PBS.
Okay.
And then specifically, they have to rewrite their grant rules, the television and radio community service grants, by June 30th, 2025.
So pretty quick turnaround.
Yeah. And those new rules have to explicitly ban any funding, direct or indirect, going to NPR or PBS. Plus, even under the current 2024 rules, they're told to minimize or get rid of any indirect funding flowing to them, within the law.
So the CPB is clearly the main target here, but it sounds like maybe other parts of the government are involved too.
Absolutely. This isn't just aimed at the CPB. The order actually directs the heads of all executive departments and agencies, Department of Education, Commerce, whoever.
Right. The whole federal government, basically.
Pretty much. They're all told to find any direct or indirect funding they might currently be sending to NPR or PBS and terminate it. Again, always with the caveat, consistent with applicable law.
Okay, so step 1 is find it and stop it. Is there a step 2 for these other agencies?
Yes, there is. After they do that initial sweep and termination, they then have to look at any remaining grants, contracts, or other funding agreements they might still have with NPR or PBS.
Why would there be remaining ones if they just terminated funding?
Well, maybe some contracts have specific clauses, or maybe the funding isn't solely for news content, perhaps. The order doesn't spell out every possibility, but it tells agencies to review whatever's left.
And do what with them?
They need to figure out if NPR or PBS are actually complying with the terms of those specific agreements. And if they find any non-compliance, they're instructed to take appropriate action.
Okay, appropriate action. Kind of vague, but clear intent.
It leaves room for the specifics of each contract or grant, presumably.
Now, something else that stood out was bringing in HHS, Health and Human Services, and this focus on non-discrimination. Why that specific department and that specific issue? Seems a bit different from the bias argument.
It is a distinct angle, and it's significant. The order specifically tasks the Secretary of Health and Human Services with investigating whether NPR and PBS, or, interestingly, any successor organizations they might create.
Successor organizations.
Okay, whether they are complying with the existing law that prohibits discrimination in employment based on race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. That's already on the books.
Right, standard employment law stuff.
Exactly. So HHS has to check if they're following that law, and if the secretary finds they aren't complying, they're told to take corrective action. So it adds this whole other dimension beyond just the content it brings in workplace practices and equality.
It really feels like they're trying to cover all the bases with this order. Are there any, like, safety valves?
Yeah.
Or caveats about legal challenges or anything like that?
Yeah, there are a few standard but important clauses tucked in there. One is a severability clause.
Severability.
It basically means if a court decides one part of the order is invalid or illegal, the rest of the order still stands. It doesn't automatically kill the whole thing.
Okay, makes sense.
Then there are general provisions saying, you know, this order doesn't cancel out any existing legal powers agencies already have, and it doesn't interfere with the Office of Management and Budget's job. And crucially, it stresses that everything done under this order has to follow existing laws and depend on whether Congress actually appropriates the money.
So it's not a magic wand. It still depends on laws and budgets.
Exactly. It sets a direction, but implementation has constraints. And one more thing, it explicitly says this order doesn't create any new rights for anyone else to sue the government over.
Meaning you or I couldn't just file a lawsuit based purely on this order existing.
Right. That's a pretty standard clause in these types of executive actions. It limits who has legal standing to challenge it directly.
Okay, so thinking about this whole thing, for someone listening, maybe, you know, in their late 20s, early 30s, our target audience here who maybe streams NPR podcasts or catches PBS shows sometimes, what's the real takeaway? This order seems to be built on this idea that the media world we grew up in is just fundamentally different.
That's definitely the framing. For you, the listener in that age group, this executive order really signals a potential major shift in how the government views and funds public media. It's basically saying, look, there are tons of news sources now, many you probably use daily, so direct taxpayer support for these specific legacy institutions maybe not needed anymore, maybe even problematic.
And the potential impact.
Well, the consequences could be significant. You might see changes in the kinds of programming NPR and PBS can offer, maybe shifts in their focus, or even, bigger questions about how they sustain themselves long-term in their current form if this federal funding disappears. It's a real challenge to a model that's been around for, over 50 years?
Yeah, long time. Okay, so just to recap the key points. We've got this executive order, ending taxpayer subsidization of biased media. Its clear goal is to cut off federal funding for NPR and PBS.
Right.
The main arguments are, 1, the media world has totally changed since the 60s. Lots of alternatives exist now. 2, taxpayer money should only fund news that is strictly unbiased. And it gives direct orders to the CPB and all other federal agencies to stop funding, directly and indirectly. Plus, there's that added angle about checking for non-discrimination in employment via HHS.
That sums it up really well. It's a policy decision with potentially really big ripples for the media you use, the media landscape in general.
Which leads us to, I guess, the big question this whole thing raises for you, the listener, to mull over. In this crazy media environment we're in, with information coming at us from everywhere, what do you think is the best way, the most sustainable, the fairest way to actually fund high-quality journalism that serves the public interest?
It's a tough one. There's no easy answer.
Definitely not. But this executive order really forces us to confront it, doesn't it? We'd really encourage you to think about it, maybe read up on different funding models, and just keep thinking critically about where your information comes from and, yeah, how it gets paid for.
Because the media landscape isn't static, it's always evolving.
Absolutely. And understanding these kinds of shifts is pretty crucial for all of us navigating it.